Well, good afternoon, Holy Trinity. This is Pastor Daniel checking in for the first of our 3 stewardship videos. Now, it's been a long time since I've been able to do a video. These videos were very commonplace about a year ago when we had our shutdown for COVID, and I was able to communicate to the church through all of these video updates that I would do. The worship was done through video. The announcements and updates were done through video. But once we started to gather again, the video updates were no longer needed because we were doing the announcements in person. So it's been a while since I've been able to do a video like this. We decided to do these videos for stewardship because we got a lot of positive feedback from them last year. You know, the more traditional model was to have some sort of gathering, a dinner, things like that, where we would do a presentation on stewardship, maybe have a stewardship speaker come and talk. And that would basically kick off the stewardship campaign. But with COVID, we weren't able to do that. And so we resorted to these videos where I made a series of 3 videos and I focused on a different aspect of our stewardship. And we sent them out so people could watch them in their homes. Well, we got a lot of positive feedback from them. And so we decided, well, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And so we're going to do the videos again this year. And so this is the first of the 3 videos. And this particular video is going to be entitled The Numbers, just like it was last year. The first video really focused on the financials of the church, the budget, the formation of the budget, and the pledging. And the numbers that we got through the pledging through last year, we're going to redo for this year. And so I'm using the Zoom platform. So this is Zoom. And as you can see, I have a background. I'm not actually in the church, which explains why there's a white sash on the cross. This is a picture that I took of our church during Easter. And so that's why the white sash is there. I'm not actually in the church. This is a virtual background. I'm sitting in the office as I record this video. But Zoom allows me to incorporate a PowerPoint presentation into today's video, which is critical so that I can show graphs and numbers and things like that will help us along in our presentation. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive in. Let me bring up the PowerPoint presentation and get that up and rolling. And we're just going to dive right on into the presentation for today. So here we go. I have the PowerPoint presentation up, and let's dive right in. So why pledge? Why is it important to pledge? Why is it important for church growth? For those of you that saw last year's video, just by the way, you'll recognize a lot of these slides. I'm essentially using the same PowerPoint because it's a good educational PowerPoint. We have new members of the church. We have people that are attending Holy Trinity for the first time. And I think it's a great also refresher for those who have been with us. Well, I do some introductory slides on church finance and how the finances here work at the church. And so we're going to go back through those again. I've made some modifications as I have learned and grown with my time here at Holy Trinity. And also all of the graphs and the numbers are going to reflect this year's numbers as opposed to last year's numbers. So I started last year with why pledge? Why is pledging so important to church growth? Well, to be put simply, pledging equals a plan. In order for us to make plans for the future, in order for us to make decisions with regards to growing things on our facilities, when able to expand services that we have offered here at the church, formational things, everything from staffing, additional staff members and people that are going to work for the church, programming. I mean, you name it. In order for us to plan, we have to have a solid financial plan behind that. And in order to create the solid financial plan, pledging is an integral part of that because that tells us what to expect for our income for the next year. And that's why we pledge now. So we form our budget, and then that'll be the budget that we operate from for the next year. Now, I wanted to go back over this slide, and this is one of the ones that I changed from last year. I've added some more detail to this slide, but it is important to talk about the three major designation of funds within the church. We have operating funds, we have designated funds, and then we have restricted funds. And I'm going to go through these in reverse order. We'll talk about restricted, then designated, and then ultimately operating, because that's where we're going to spend most of our time talking during today's video. So what are restricted funds? Restricted funds, in essence, are our endowment. Holy Trinity has an endowment. And you may be asking yourself, well, what is an endowment? Well, an endowment are funds that are not accessible for spending. And what I mean by that is these are monies that are given to the church that build a principle for investment. So an endowment is invested funds, and funds are contributed to the endowment. And then the principle is what is restricted. That's why it's called a restricted funds. The monies that are given to the church, that principle that builds over time is restricted. That means that it cannot be spent. It has been restricted and designated for this purpose. And once they go in, they stay and never come back out. And that's the whole point of an endowment. Therefore, it can build over time, and the interest off of that principle that has been invested is able to be spent. So you don't spend the principal, that is restricted, but the proceeds or the interest that come off of it is able to be spent. And that is one of the funds that we have. I'll end with this. Endowments are best built through legacy and estate gifts. These are folks that put the church in their wills and things like that. And so after they pass on to go and be with the Lord, those funds are usually given to the church, and we can place them in the endowment. And then they give back to the church in perpetuity. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the endowment in this video, but we do have in this next year, in this next coming year, I just want to let everyone know, we're going to be talking about the church endowment a lot more throughout the year, because we'd like to bring the level of awareness up with our church endowment as it is now starting to grow, and we're looking forward to the continued growth of that endowment. Designated funds. So what are designated funds? So these are funds that are set aside for specific purposes, but they are outside of the budget. So the annual budget that we'll talk about next, those funds, once they don't roll over year to year. We set an annual budget, we expect to spend those monies, and then we create a new budget. Designated funds are outside of the annual budget. And as I said, they are set aside for specific named purposes. So like outreach is a designated fund, Altar Guild, Cursillo, Memorial Garden. We have other funds where people have contributed money to these, or they've been allotted, excess funds, say from the budget year, would be allotted and designated for this. And then they go into a separate account, and then they can actually accrue over time. But unlike the restricted funds, we can spend these for these specific purposes that they've been allocated for. We also have an operating reserve. This is also a designated fund. This is a reserve fund that we have that would cover expenses that exceed the annual budget. So let's say we add a service or we change a service like lawn care. That happened this particular year. Our lawn care, we expanded lawn care, but the new servicer, the cost went up, and that wasn't budgeted for 2021, sorry. So operating reserve is an account that can help us cover those expenses that might hit the budget where we didn't budget for them. And then finally, we have a capital reserve. So this is monies that we have set aside that help us with large projects, large capital projects. So for instance, let's say one of the large air conditioner units in the church were to suddenly fail. Well, that's a very, very expensive piece of equipment, and it would cost us significant monies to be able to replace it, but we would need to be able to replace it as soon as possible. We have a capital reserve account now that we can dip into if one of these things were to happen, or if we want to do additional improvements. So let's say we wanted to renovate a room for Sunday school, which is what we've done. We renovated a storeroom up in the church, and we are now in the process of turning that into a Sunday school room. We can use some of the funds from the capital reserve to make that happen. And finally, it's also an emergency fund. These are funds that if any kind of emergency were to happen on campus, let's say we had a hurricane and the hurricane did major damage to our property. Well, we have insurance, but we also have a large hurricane deductible that we would have to meet in order for the insurance funds to kick in. We would be able to use these capital reserve funds to meet that deductible so that we can move forward with our insurance if we were to have a major disaster on campus. And so that's capital reserve. They are monies that are set aside for this specific purpose. So this encompasses our designated funds. But now we're going to talk about operating funds. And this is the main point of this particular video. Operating funds are the day-to-day costs and expenses that we incur in order to simply run the church. As they say, to keep the lights on, to keep the doors open. These are our operating funds, and this is how we pay for these things. And they include, employee salaries and benefits. So just like any business, your top costs are always going to be your personnel, the employees, and the employee costs that are associated with having employees. You have buildings and grounds. Of course, there's all of the operations of the church, the facilities, the electric bill, the water bill, the internet costs so that we can have internet, all of our repairs that we need, all of our services that we are required to have, everything from our alarm to the fire service to the elevator that has to be inspected and serviced periodically, all the costs associated with our kitchen, from the electricity to the dishwasher to the propane. All of that is building and operations. And then, of course, needed repairs and maintenance. All the light bulbs that go out that have to be replaced almost all the time around here. These are all costs that are associated with building and operations. You have administrative. These are the office costs. This would be everything from our software that we have to paying for our live stream and website, all of our costs for the computers and the software. Then you've got all of the office costs and things, paper and printing and things like that. These are all administrative costs that are associated with running the church. And then you have programming. So this is the actual programming of the church. What we do when we gather, everything from Christian formation to our fellowship events, to worship, altar guild, things like that. Everything from the bread and the wine that we have to purchase, to the candles, to the oil in the candles, and to all the other things associated with worship itself. This is all programming and things that we do, like Alpha Program and the meals for that and the costs for that, for this upcoming Sunday school that we're about to open, and paying for the materials for Sunday school and things like that. This is all part of our programming. And then, of course, everybody's favorite, the diocesan apportionment. So for those that do not know, we are required by the diocese to pay a 10% tithe back to the diocese. And that's how the diocese forms its annual budget. So as a parish in the church, as an independent church and parish within the diocese, when we earn that status, we also owe the diocese a 10% tithe on all the funding that we bring in. And the diocese has a formula on how this is calculated and everything. But every year we have to pay that to the diocese, and we incorporate that back into the operating budget. So it is a budgeted amount that we already know from the diocese what we're going to owe them. And then we budget that out throughout the year to be able to pay that to the diocese. So this constitutes our annual budget. When we sit down at the end of a year and we look at the projected revenues that are going to come into the church, and we look at all the projected costs that we're looking at for the next year, and then any additions, rates always go up. They don't go down. Electric, water, all of your costs, all your services, all the people that come onto campus to do things, costs only go up. Employee costs only go up every single year. and the apportionment flows with how much money is coming in. But we have to look at that and inform the budget for the next year. And we take into consideration, like I talked about at the beginning, a plan. What are the things we wish to expand for the next year? What are the things we wish to grow for the next year? When we do these things, we have to plan that into the budget for the next year. And like I said, it's the revenues that coming in, the pledging, that allows us to make the plan and design the annual budget. So, and as I just said, it is primarily funded through pledging, or it should be. And I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. You know, your operating funds, your annual budget is primarily funded through the pledging of the membership of the church. So let's look at this graph. We looked at a graph very similar to this last year, and I have updated it for the values for this year. And at the very bottom, you know, this year's budget for 2021 was $379,575. This was our annual budget. This is the money going out and the money coming in, so that we can have a balanced budget and be able to appropriately spend the funds that we were projecting. So these are budgeted funds, right? This is what last year we anticipated this year to look like. On the revenue side, which is the left pie graph, you see revenues budget. So these were the budgeted income and revenues that we figured were coming into the church. 50% are the blue, and that is our pledging. So 50% of this year's budgeted revenues constitute the pledging. 40%, the red, comes from our thrift store. And we're going to come back to this. I'm not going to make comments about this yet. Just so you know, 50%, half of our entire budgeted revenues come from pledging. 40% come from the thrift store. 5% are what they call non-pledge contributions. So they are monies that are given to the church that are outside the pledging, but they are also known. They what they call a giver of record. People go on record to giving monies, but it was outside the pledging amounts. 2% are the Christmas and Easter giving. We tend to see a boost in giving around Christmas and Easter, and so we incorporate that into the budget. And so that was 2%. Another 2% is other. Those are revenues that we get for people who use the site outside operations, like Alcoholics Anonymous and some other groups that use our site for their meetings and such, and they usually end up making some sort of contribution to the church for that. And then the little green sliver is just what we call loose plate. So those would just be cash monies that are given on Sunday morning or at other events, but they're not tied to any particular person because they were just cash that was thrown into the plate. And that's loose plate, and that constitutes about 1% of the revenues. Moving over to the expense side, which is the graph on the right, you can see that 54% are the salaries and budgets. Salaries and benefits. So 54% of the budget has to cover salaries and benefits. And this is very normal. If you've ever run your own business or you understand human resources, any company, whether it is a nonprofit, for-profit, church, your highest expense is always going to be salaries and benefits. It's the personnel component of keeping people on staff. And in our case, the next highest, and 29%, is buildings and grounds. That makes sense. That is all of the bills that we pay and everything that it costs us to keep the church up and running and the doors open and everything moving smoothly from the facilities and building standpoint. 10% goes to the diocese. There's that 10% tithe that I was talking about. 10% of our budget is dedicated to the diocese, and we pay that back to the diocese. And then 4% is programming, the costs that we have to keep the actual church programming moving forward. And then 3% is administrative. So this is a breakdown of what our budget looks like, both from the revenue side and from the expense side. And the percentages are simply, if you want to know the actual dollar values, you can take 379,575, multiply it by the percent, and you'll get the dollar values that each one of these corresponds to. Couple of issues. So I had this slide last year, And the first of the two issues was a historical downward trend in pledging. Now, I left this slide here only because I don't know if I can say we're fully out of the historical downward trend just yet, but we definitely made some noticeable improvements from last year. And what am I talking about? So let's look at this graph. This graph I posted last year. I have updated the graph to include the final 2020 figures and the 2021 figures. And I want to dive into a little bit of explanation here because some of the figures are a little misleading, but some of the figures are actually good and positive. So for 2020, if you look at the values for 2020, and you can see my cursor moving here, the green is the worship attendance, what we call average Sunday attendance, or ASA. This is a figure that we calculate through the year and we turn into the diocese at the end of the year. The orange is the number of pledges. So that is the number of pledging units, as they say. So for instance, a single person who pledges is one pledging unit, but maybe a couple who attends church, a husband and a wife, they would constitute one pledging unit, but it's still two people in worship. And again, like a family, maybe a family of four, they are four people that are attending worship, but they still are one pledging unit. And I'll come back to that, why that's important in a minute. And in the blue line up here is the total dollars pledged. Okay, so let's go into the green bar for 2020. Now, here's what's interesting. So you look at the downward trend, right? If you go back to all the way from 2010, you see the overall downward trend, but then we pop back up in 2020. So this is misleading, and I'll tell you why this is misleading. I mean, we were closed and shut down a good chunk of 2020 and had low attendance in 2020. But why did it jump up? Well, so that's because when the diocese asked for the average Sunday attendance numbers for this year, they requested that we only do January, February, and March. All right. And then they excluded the whole rest of the year because many churches were shut down because of COVID. And so the official number that was turned into the diocese only was January, February, March of 2020, which we did see an uptick in attendance because I had arrived in February and a lot of people came. I guess they wanted to check out, the new guy and see the new guy. And so we had a bump in average Sunday attendance. But then, of course, we shut down for COVID and we had zero attendance for a while. And then even after we reopened, we never got back to the values that we were in February and March. And that's why this figure is up on the graph, because I've put the official figure that we turned into the diocese, but you have to take it with a grain of salt because that was only January through March. If you were to average in the whole year, or even look at the average Sunday attendance after COVID, it would have been way down here, possibly half of what this bar is. So you have to understand that attendance really didn't go up. It only went up for a short time, but after COVID, it has hovered down here in this sector, just like it is for 2021. So that's important to keep in mind. The pledge numbers for 2020, I mean, they were set at the beginning of the year. That doesn't change over the year, and we had 72 pledging units, and this was the dollar amount. I forget the actual dollar amount off the top of my head, but this is it on the graph. Moving into 2021. Well, of course, 2021 isn't over, so we haven't been able to calculate the actual average Sunday attendance. But I just did some rough calculations and entered the value. And, we honestly hover around 70-ish people, 60 to 70 on any given Sunday nowadays. And so I put that in so we could visually see what it looks like. It's still, even from 2019, a stark difference. And a lot of that has to do with many people are still staying home for COVID and things like that and enjoying the worship on the live stream. So they're not coming in person, but they're on live stream, but we don't have a way to accurately count that. But here's the thing. The pledging units continued to drop. So when we went from 2020 to 2021, after last year's pledge campaign, we went from 72 to 70. So we actually went down 2 pledging units. However, if you look at the blue line went up. The actual total amount pledged to the church increased. And this is huge. And I talked about this at the annual meeting last year, that even in the middle of the pandemic, and even though we actually went down in number of units, the total dollar amount pledged to the church rose in the middle of the pandemic. And as we were coming out of that shutdown and everything. So this was an incredible accomplishment by Holy Trinity. And I was blown away by what we were able to accomplish. And this is definitely a pat yourself on the back kind of a moment to be able to do what occurred here and to be able to celebrate the way that God blessed us from 2020 to 2021. And so this is the pledge history. And we'll come back to this graph in just a minute. The pledge distribution. Many people ask, what does the pledging distribution look like for the church? And this is what it looks like. So these, on the left-hand side, this is the dollar amounts per month that people pledged to the church. And then the green bar graph represents the number of people that pledged. So we'll go down, for instance, 6 people of the 70 pledges, 6 of the 70, those people give 800 plus per month. We have 3 that are in the 500 to 750 per month range, 6 that are in the 260 to 300 range, 4 that are exactly 250 a month, 7 that are in a 175 to 220 range, 9 that are in the 110, 170 range, 7 that are in the $100 per month range exactly. And we have 14 that are between 55 and 95 per month, and then 14 that are 50 or less per month. So this is the pledge distribution, and I'll also come back to this graph in just a second. So a couple of issues. We talked about the historical downward trend. Like I said, there were some definite improvements, but because of COVID, we definitely still have some identifiable downward trends when it comes to worship attendance, number of pledges, but we did go up in the overall dollar amount. So I don't know if I can say exactly yet that we are out of the historical downward trend, but there's indicators that we are on the rise. And maybe by the annual meeting, I'll be able to present the actual figures. So everything we've been looking at is the pledging figures. But at the annual meeting, I go over the actual figures for the end of the year. And hopefully I'll be able to overlay that on the graph that I just showed you and be able to show some marketably different figures. But the other issue is the overdependence on the thrift store. And this is not really a secret. I talked at length about this last year, and will continue to be a component of our conversation. So of the $379,575 budget, 40% came from the thrift store. And another way to look at it, in order for us to hit that $379,575 budget that we need to keep the operations of the church moving forward in its current status, we have to basically make sure that the thrift store operates at these level revenues in order to break even, is a way to look at it. And this is a really skewed. You have to think many churches, they do not have this luxury. They have to generate the most of their revenues through the giving and the pledging of the church. And this 50% looks more like 70% for most other churches. And even most other churches that have a thrift store, they don't turn the kind of revenues that we do. I mean, that is one of the blessings, and I'll get to that in one of the next videos when I talk about blessings. That is one of the blessings of this church is we have, without a doubt, I think the top performing thrift store in the entire diocese. It is just amazing what our thrift store is able to accomplish and the blessings that it both brings into the church, but also how we can in turn continue to bless the community around us. It is an incredible thing, our thrift store. I almost get speechless trying to describe it, because I often find myself dumbfounded with what our thrift store is able to do. But at the same time, it becomes a bit of a crutch. We over rely on the thrift store to carry us financially. And how much is that? That's $152,000 a year that we need from the thrift store in order to make our budget work. This is a sizable dollar amount. This actually went up from last year. Last year we were at around $132,000 that we needed from the thrift store in order to make our budget. Now, like I said, giving went up. Giving definitely went up. But we also increased the budget because we were growing and expanding, and we had other things we needed to do. We had some salaried positions to fill, and we also wanted to grow in some new areas. And so the budget increased, the giving increased, but it also we had to increase the amount of money coming in from the thrift store. This is one of the things that we're looking to begin to tackle, to be able to have the membership of the church support the operating budget more so we don't have to rely on the thrift store as much, and that $152,000. So this will be an ongoing conversation. We will be talking about this more next year in ways that we hope to be able to tackle this specific dollar amount. So how do we fix it? I had this slide last year. How do we fix? Well, obviously we can increase the total number of pledges coming into the church. The more number of pledges you have, obviously the greater the revenues from the pledging. But I want to bring this up real fast. One interesting thing, remember earlier I was talking about, the average Sunday attendance versus the number of pledging units of people who pledge. So your average Sunday attendance is always going to be high. When you have married couples that are pledging and families that are pledging, they bring more people in on Sunday morning, but they still represent one pledging unit. So the ratio between, it's never going to be 1-to-1, or it shouldn't be, because that wouldn't make a lot of sense. But I will say Holy Trinity has one of the best ratios. I mean, when you consider that the average Sunday attendance, even at its peak, was about 130 people, that 70 of the 130 are pledging. When you consider families and things like that, this is a phenomenal ratio. We do very, very well with the number of people who attend on Sunday morning versus the number of pledges that are coming in. And I say all that to say, I don't know if we're going to be able to improve that very much within our own membership. I think our own membership does a great job of pledging to the church. So how are we going to grow the number of pledges? Well, the only way you can grow the number of pledges is we have to grow the number of people coming into the church. New members, new membership, people that we know that might be looking for a church home, bringing them in and inviting them. This is going to be another big initiative in 2022, starting to go out there and look for people that we think might be looking for a church home and inviting them to Holy Trinity. And maybe they might like Holy Trinity and what we're doing here, and join and become members. That'll be the biggest way that we're going to have an impact on growing the number of pledges that we get, right? So how do we increase the total number of pledges? But then, of course, we can increase the amount per pledge. We did some good work here last year. As I said, when the total number of pledges went down, but the total dollar amount went up, that means we had an impact here. We were able to increase the amount per pledge of the existing membership of the church. And that brings me back to this distribution graph. And I will propose to you that our distribution graph is a little skewed. It's heavy on one side. And ideally, our distribution graph could look a little more parabolic. What that means, if you know what a parabola or a parabolic graph looks like, it means that your ends are smaller, but the middle is larger. So it looks like a hill. This is kind of a sideways hill. Ideally, our graph should look more like this. What that means is the workhorse or where a bulk of the pledging is happening is right in the middle range dollar amount. That would be the sign of a very healthy church financially, is if the bulk of the monies coming in being pledged is in the middle of the graph instead of on one side of the graph. I do think there's still some work that we can do here in-house at Holy Trinity to continue to improve this. We're getting there, but I think there's a little more work that we can do as we garner up excitement about the future and the future plans for this church to be able to improve this middle section a little bit in our pledge distribution. And that's simply up to the members of this church as they discern their pledging for next year. And so hopefully I'll be able to have a good report on this at the annual meeting after we get all the 2022 pledging in. So how do we fix? We increase the total number of pledges. We increase the amount per pledge, but I really want to end with this. Every pledge matters. I mean, this is what allows us to plan, as I talked about at the beginning. Every single pledge matters. I don't want to underscore this too much. I want to emphasize this, is that it doesn't really matter at the end of the day where you are in the distribution or if you're able to give more or not. Every single pledge matters, because that is what allows us to give back to our church and allows the church to make plans for the future. And that is why it is so critical to go back to the original slide. We have some incredible ideas that we're cooking up all across the church. Everything from some new and different initiatives in Christian formation to we've been hearing about it on Sunday mornings with new things we're doing in outreach. And we have some even grander plans on deck that we're looking to do in 2022. We have facilities needs and facilities items that we need to move forward with, and some pretty large scale plans there that we are discerning right now and hopefully going to unveil at the annual meeting. Staffing. I mean, we were able to hire a part-time Sunday school teacher who's going to be able to take Sunday school and turn that into a ministry and move forward. We hired Juan, our new music director. We were able to do that this past year because the giving went up, and we were able to borrow some money from the thrift store and continue to take advantage of those revenues so that we can grow the ministries. But going into 2022, there's even more stuff that we'd like to do. And in order to do that, we need a plan. And in order to be able to plan, we have to know where we stand financially. So why pledge? Pledge equals plan. It allows us to be able to plan. Once we know where roughly we sit financially, we can take certain leaps of faith, like we did this year when we grew the lawn service, when we grew Sunday school, when we hired Juan, and a couple of other things where we felt the church was behind us. And so we could make a leap of faith, and that God was going to continue to honor and bless this church and make certain decisions. And now we want to do all the more for 2022. And it all starts with our pledge season. So that is the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I know this is probably the longest of all the videos because I got to go through the slides and the numbers and things like that. And so I do hope this was helpful for you. I know it's a lot of numbers, and some people, when we start talking about numbers and money and everything, it gets a little uncomfortable. The next videos will be a little different, where we talk about blessings and things like that, and all of the more non-monetary things that we have done for each other, that we have done for the community, and that God has done for us. But yeah, at the same time, these numbers are important, and there are folks who really want to see the numbers and dive into the numbers. So this is your video. This is the video for you. But know that if this video maybe wasn't your cup of tea, other videos are coming that we're going to try to cover all the bases with regards to stewardship this year. So that's the video. Stay tuned. We've got 2 more coming, and they will be coming shortly over the next week or so. But as I have used to say when we were doing all of our videos, back in the day. Until I get to see you again, just know that my prayers are with you, and may God's blessings be upon us all.